Shut up and sit down. Shut up and sit down.
It is becoming increasingly obvious that Parliament has nothing but contempt for the views and opinions of the majority in this country. Parliament freely and continuously acts against the interests and wishes of the people, wilfully ignoring the people's demonstrable desire for change in the direction that Parliament is taking this country. In fact, Parliament has become so contemptuous of the people, the charges that Parliament laid against the Crown in the 1688 Bill of Rights can now be laid against Parliament itself. Using the precedent set by Parliament in the 1688 Bill of Rights, it is time for the people to demand that Parliament yields and grants a Bill of Common Rights to the people. This bill will grant the people the basic inalienable rights required to maintain a functioning and genuine democracy. It will also redefine Parliament's sovereignty as only being derived from the will of the people, transitioning the country from a constitutional monarchy to a crowned republic, and it will bind Parliament to the democratic will of the people. But why do we need a new bill when we already have the Human Rights Act? Well, this act is simply cut and paste legislation that was written as to be acceptable to the largest number possible amongst a very diverse group of nations. Articles 9, 10 and 11, therefore, are rendered all but useless as the second part of each gives the unbounded ability to apply exceptions to the articles. For example, Article 10, the freedom of expression, Part 2 contains the line, may be subject to such formalities, conditions, restrictions or penalties as prescribed by law. This is in conjunction with, for the prevention of disorder or crime, for the protection of health or morals. But with no definition of who decides the morals, a minority can impose restrictions on the speech of the majority by having it prescribed by law and therefore making it a crime to express. So why do we need a new Bill of Common Rights when we already have the Human Rights Act? Well, it's because we need a core piece of constitutional or administrative common law to set the boundaries that limit the extent to which codified law can restrict the fundamental rights required to maintain a functioning democracy. The bill that I propose will contain 12 articles. The first article is the charges laid against Parliament, the second, freedom of speech, the third, freedom of assembly, fourth, freedom of expression, fifth, freedom and responsibility of the press, sixth, freedom of religion, the seventh, parliamentary sovereignty, the eighth, government of the day, the ninth, freedom of election, 10th, membership of Parliament, 11th, reparation of the abuses of the powers of Parliament, and 12th, a new parliamentary oath of allegiance. The first article, charges laid against Parliament, starts with the opening paragraphs. We the people of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland do declare that Parliament, by the assistance of diverse members of the House of Lords, members of the House of Commons, Ministers of State, members of the Judiciary, councillors and diverse vested interests employed by Parliament, did endeavour to subvert and extirpate the laws, liberties and rights of the people, and did treat the people with the same contempts and indignities as once suffered by Parliament under the Crown. This is worded in a very similar way to the original 1688 Bill of Rights. Other than laying the charges at Parliament's feet, it doesn't name any of the co-conspirators, so to speak. And with the actual crimes they are charged with, again, there's no specific individual cases specified. It's just a generalization. And if this was good enough for the Bill of Rights, it is good enough for the Bill of Common Rights. We now come to the specific charges. The first one of which is the dispensing and suspending of power. By assuming and exercising a power of dispensing with and suspending of laws and the execution of laws without consent of the people. This is in fact a direct lift from the 1688 Bill of Rights, and I have just changed from consent of Parliament to consent of the people. The second charge is levying money and taking subsidy. By levying money for their own enrichment, and have and do bestow on themselves rights, benefits, allowances and subsidy not available to the people. Anybody who follows British politics is well aware of the perennial expenses scandals that we always seem to hear about, and the fact that Parliament is consistently voting themselves pay rises far in excess of what the average working man is getting in the street. There's also the fact that even though it's sniff-naff and trivia, there are certain dispensations that members of the Parliament get that aren't supplied to the rest of the nation. And this just shows a contemptuous attitude that they have towards us. The third charge is violating elections. By violating the freedom of election of members to serve in Parliament by the proscribing of parties and the prosecution of their adherents for giving voice to their beliefs and opinions when they had otherwise committed no crime, and therefore violating the people's freedom of thought, freedom of opinion, and freedom of speech. When it comes to proscribing political parties, unless they are actively involved in promoting acts of violence, there is no excuse. Because prescribing political parties simply because you find their views abhorrent doesn't work. It alienates a significant proportion of the electorate who drop out of the electoral process, and it gives you a very skewed view of what the public consensus and opinion is. And for democracy to work, Parliament has to be aware of the full gamut of the political opinion of the people in the country. The next charge is imposition of blasphemy. By deliberate and wilful conflation did enforce blasphemy, in contradiction to the law and to the detriment of the established church, thereby enforcing ideologies antithesis to the temperament, character, traditions, beliefs, and discriminations, tastes, judgments, discernments, insights of the people, and did therefore limit the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and the freedom of expression, and subject the people to illegal prosecutions. Now, the first thing I will mention there is the brackets. The reason I put taste, judgments, discernments, and insights in there is because there's a significant amount of the population today that do not have no appreciation of the complexity and subtlety of the English language, and are incapable of holding any more than one definition for a word, and are incapable of taking a definition for a word in the context in which it is used. The second thing I should point out is that we do have an established church in the UK. In England, it's the Church of England. It does have its own synod, but any rules that the synod passes have to pass through the House of Commons and the House of Lords. So effectively, we have a state-controlled religion in this country. As to the overall meaning of this one, I think it is quite obvious to anybody who keeps up to date with the political situation in this country as to what's going on. You see, we don't have any blasphemy laws in this country. In fact, the Racial and Religious Hatred Acts of 2006, Part 29J, clearly states that nothing in this part shall be read or given effect in a way which prohibits or restricts discussion, criticism, or expressions of antipathy, dislike, ridicule, insult, or abuse of particular religions. But whether it is through complicity or cowardice, the conflation of race and religion is constantly being made. If this is just being done as an expedient way to keep the peace, this is wrong. Well, it's wrong on either case. But you can't keep the peace by preventing from people carrying out their legally granted rights. You keep the peace by policing those that would use violence to stop people carrying out their legally granted rights. And this brings us on to our last charge, illegal prosecutions. By the prosecutions in the courts for matters and causes cognizable only in the consciousness of the people and the sum of their individual discriminations, and by diverse other arbitrary and illegal courses, did limit the people's freedom of thought, freedom of opinion, and freedom of speech, and thereby enslave them by subjugating their free will. Might be going a bit far on the end there with the enslaving, But again, anybody who's been keeping an eye on the situation in this country with the prosecution of Count Dankula, there was a girl who was prosecuted for posting rap lyrics to her social media page. It's becoming clear that we are developing a very censorious attitude in this country. Taste is not up to the government to legislate. Taste is an individual discrimination. It's your own. If you don't like it, don't watch it. We are heading back into a level of censorship not seen in this country for well over 50 years. And it's a step backwards. Once the government can dictate to you how you think about one thing, they will dictate to you how you think about another thing. This is the end of free speech, this is the end of the freedom of thought, and this is the end of democracy. And the closing paragraph in this article is the subject's rights. And thereupon the people, taken into their most serious consideration, the best means for attaining the ends aforesaid, do in the first place, as their ancestors in like case have usually done, for the vindicating and asserting of their inalienable rights and liberties, do declare that, being there a single law for all, and all being equally under this law, these articles to be eternally binding upon Parliament. That is pretty much taken word for word from the original 1688 Bill of Rights. I've changed ancient rights to inalienable rights, and I added being there a single law for all, and all being equally under this law. That's the only difference to it. And then from then on we go into the articles of saying how the law will change. Now we get into the part of the bill that starts to guarantee our rights, starting with Article 2, the freedom of speech. The first paragraph of this, that the freedom of speech and debates or proceedings in Parliament ought not to be impeached or questioned in any court or place out of Parliament other than the consciousness of the people and the sphere of the people's public and private debates, is basically taken from the original 1688 Bill of Rights, with the addition of other than the consciousness of the people and the sphere of the people's public or private debates, because originally that wasn't there, and that could be interpreted that the people do not have the right to discuss what Parliament is doing, which in a democracy is quite obviously wrong. The second paragraph goes on to say, and that this right is extended without immunity from libel and slander to all people of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland eligible to elect members of said Parliament. It's self-explanatory, I would think. And then the third one, and that this right, in the absence of direct and credible incitements to commit, and or direct and credible threats of physical violence, is absolute. Again, I think that is pretty self-explanatory. The article goes on to say, nor can this freedom be used to impose or call for limitations to, or by action prevent, the application of this freedom by any eligible person, and any and all such endeavours shall be prosecuted under the law. You can't use the freedom of speech to call for limitations of the freedom of speech. And or by actions prevent is there to stop this deplatforming of people who are speaking legitimately. Yes, you can protest the fact that they are speaking, but you cannot stop them from speaking. The article then finishes with, furthermore, be they secular, religious, ideological, political, cultural, or social, no individual, group, legal or statutory entity, government body or office can petition for or be granted protection from discussion, criticism, or expressions of antipathy, dislike, ridicule, insult, or abuse of their beliefs, practices, ideologies, or opinions, unless on an individual case-by-case basis such actions come in the form of direct and credible threats of, or direct and credible incitements to cause physical harm to an individual or individuals. This is designed to stop people pleading that they are a special case, especially the government. The wording at the end this time with the incitements to commit and the threats of have been changed to physical harm, because this brings across the point that you don't actually have to threaten or commit acts of violence to do harm to someone, but it has to be physical harm. For example, you can get people to harangue an old man, and if you just stand there yelling abuse at him, you have not made any physical threats against him, but if he kills over with a heart attack, he has suffered physical harm. The third article is freedom of assembly. The right of the people to non-violent, peaceful, free assembly cannot be limited other than where there is a direct and credible threat to the public safety, excluding fears of violence from others, with no consideration given to inconvenience or disruption to trade or commerce, public or private, unless such assembly runs contrary to these articles or prevents the application of these articles by others. This paragraph is written in such a way that no limits can be placed other than what's in yellow, unless what is in blue. The first line is self-explanatory. Unless there is direct and credible threats to the public safety, this is to prevent overcrowding, to prevent crush injuries, so the police can limit the flow of people into a given area, or to uphold existing occupancy limits due to fire safety and the like. The excluding fears of violence from others, as I stated previously, you cannot keep the peace by stopping people partaking of their legal rights. You keep the peace by policing those who would use violence to stop people partaking of their legal rights. With no consideration given to inconvenience or disruption to trade and commerce, public or private, that is to allow the continuation of strikes, the use of financial boycotts and financial pressures as a legitimate way of protest, and unless such assembly runs contrary to these articles or prevents the application of these articles by others, well, this is obviously, it has to be peaceful protest, it can't be calling for threats of violence, and basically if you're demonstrating something, if you're assembling against somebody, you may want to blockade them, but other people might still want to use them. So in essence, you can't blockade the street. You can blockade the path, you can blockade the road. You can't blockade both. You still have to allow people who disagree with you to gain access to the premises, even if it's only on foot. Article 4 is the freedom of expression. No limits to expression can be placed on the people other than those that limit the unrestricted public hearing or viewing of materials, performances, images or words deemed by the people as unsuitable for minors. Sex acts, including displays of nudity, in-person, image or performances involving under 18s, or any needless or gratuitous glorifications of sexual violence presented for voyeuristic gratification, or any other lascivious deviant entertainments, as defined or perceived by the people, unless the act of expression is done with the purposeful intent to, or by accident does, cause demonstrable widespread offence to the majority. Now, this is a long paragraph, and it's to be read in such a way that no limits to expression can be placed on the people other than what's in yellow, unless what's in blue. I should just mention here unrestricted public hearing or viewing. In the traditional sense, this is something that isn't behind a gated entrance. So a music festival that's behind a gated entrance, a theatre, a cinema, these all have gated entrances in front of them, so they are not unrestricted public hearing or viewing. But I think this also applies to your router as well. If you're paying your ISP for access to the internet for its broadband services, there is a paywall there. There is a gated entrance. So everything in your own home that is behind your router is not unrestricted public hearing or viewing. The problem comes is if you're using free Wi-Fi in shops, restaurants, on public transport, because unless they are monitoring who has access to their Wi-Fi, they are providing unrestricted public hearing or viewing. And so this is why we have codified law on top of our constitutional administrative common law. It's to sort out these sort of slight contradictions you can find, where you can say that at home your internet is not unrestricted public hearing or viewing, but outside your Wi-Fi access is unrestricted or can be unrestricted public hearing or viewing. The first part of this is obviously to still allow for film classification and broadcast media restrictions on timings for certain styles and types of program to be going out. The second part, referring to sex acts, is obviously to allow the existing laws we have on child porn and pornography. The middle bit on the any needless or gratuitous glorifications of sexual violence presented for voyeuristic gratification or any other lascivious deviant entertainments as defined or perceived by the people. Well, a nation does need morals, and it's the people that decide those morals. And so the people still need to be able to say that certain behaviours are unacceptable. The last line, unless the act of expression is done with the purposeful intent to, or by accident does, cause demonstrable widespread offence to the majority, well, that is to basically stop the outrage mob. Far too often we see the outrage mob campaign against an advert that's been seen by millions, and yet a few thousand people will complain about it and the advert will be banned. Well, that's not good enough. You can't have the minority dictating to the majority. So unless this offence is demonstrably widespread and it is the majority of people who are offended, you can't do anything about it. Because people who are meh are not going to write a letter to a company or to an ombudsman and say, oh, I saw an advert I wasn't offended by. But obviously the outrage mob will always be outraged and they are more likely to complain. And so this is to rebalance the system. We now come on to Article 5, Freedom and Responsibility of the Press. A free and self-regulating press, free to circulate information and opinion, without interference from Crown, Parliament, the judiciary, the government of the day, or individuals within said institutions, is essential for an informed electorate and the function and furtherance of democracy. This is on the understanding that news is uninterpreted facts, unbiased and free from willful omissions and untruths. Anything else is opinion and is to be clearly labelled as such. The article finishes with, and that any individual, group or entity, state, corporate or private, that declares themselves to be, or as perceived by the people acts, as a member or part of the press that fails to uphold the highest standards of due diligence and or fails to maintain the integrity of journalistic ethics as perceived by the people shall be prosecuted under the law. The regulation of the press is always been a sticky subject. The press has an inordinate amount of influence on the lives of the people when it comes to politics and to their worldview. And so there is a responsibility to being a journalist, and there needs to be certain standards that are upheld if you wish to declare yourself to be a journalist. I mean, from a personal point of view, one of the things I'd like to see is laws tightening up corrections. Too often you see a major headline splash that turns out to be factually untrue, and then the correction is buried in a little box at the back of the paper. And the same with online media. Today, the press tends to upload articles that get millions of hits that are factually wrong, and then when they correct the article to avoid being sued in the courts, it's already way down the list and nobody ever sees the correction. So I'd like to see a law that says that you have to delete the original wrong article and then publish the corrected article with the same prominence and column inches and, or in case of TV, airtime as the original article got. Article 6, freedom of religion. All individuals have the right to freely follow the belief system or religion of their choice, its practices and customs, unless such practices and customs run contrary to the above articles and the law of the land, and on the express understanding that there is no, and can never be any, recognition of blasphemy. Therefore there is no, and can never be any, prohibitions or restrictions of discussion, criticism or expressions of antipathy, dislike, ridicule, insult or abuse of particular religions or the beliefs or practices of their adherents, or any other belief system or the beliefs or practices of its adherents, or proselytizing or urging adherents of a different religion or belief system to cease practicing their religion or belief system. I think this one's pretty self-explanatory. It's just re-emphasizing the fact that Britain does not have any blasphemy laws. And I don't think that any genuine democracy can have any concept of blasphemy. Democracy has to be secular. And basically, the second half of this article is taken directly from section 29J of the Race and Religious Hatred Act. Article 7 is parliamentary sovereignty. Parliament only has sovereignty over the people by the will of the people, and has no, nor needs or requires any other authority, and as such is subservient to, and bound by, the will of the people, and neither Parliament nor groups or individuals, be they appointed, elected or employed within it, can conduct any business that cannot be brought to the immediate attention of the people. The Commons is and remains the primary elected House of Parliament, and as such has and retains the supreme authority to veto or pass laws and regulations, until such time as the second chamber is transitioned or is transitioning to being a, or is fully replaced by, plebiscite. The first paragraph of this, well, the first couple of lines in the first paragraph of this, is what transitions us from being a constitutional monarchy to a crowned republic, by defining the sovereignty of Parliament as being solely derived from the will of the people. The part about not being able to do any business that cannot be brought to the immediate attention of the people is because Parliament is the people's. And the next article, the government of the day, covers the part where you need perhaps to do certain business that's not in the immediate public interest to be known about, and that's covered, as I say, in Article 8. The second paragraph basically is just restating the fact that the Commons still has supremacy over the House of Lords, with the caveat that the second chamber should be aiming to be in transition towards, or the inclusion of, a plebiscite element at least, if not going to full plebiscite, because obviously the whole idea of democracy is for it to evolve to the point where it is government of the people by the people, and that means basically government by permanent plebiscite, where no law is passed without everyone having a vote on it. But obviously that's a long time in the future. But once you have the people being represented to a greater extent directly, and not via a second elected house, but direct people's representation in the second chamber, then the second chamber must ultimately grow to be the primary chamber. The article goes on to say, Parliament can pass no law or regulation that contradicts or limits these articles. nor can it amend these articles without the will of the people expressed by plebiscite. Said plebiscites can only offer a single option to change a single article against a no change option, with at least a 66% turnout, voting in favour in such a way that 65% of the total electorate are in favour of such change as to ensure it is the majority view of the people. Well, the first line of this is pretty self-explanatory. Parliament cannot, of its own free will, just decide that it's going to get rid of a core piece of legislation that limits its powers. And the second part is there to enable that this bill can be modified with time as public opinion changes in the very long term, but it can't be done on a whim. And so requiring a minimum turnout of 66% and requiring what is effectively a two-third majority of the total electorate means that it would have to be a very strong majority public opinion to achieve a change to this bill. And also the part where it says a single option to change a single article against a no change option, that is there so that they can't just try to rewrite the whole bill. They can only rewrite one article at a time, and that they can only give one option to change that article against the article remaining as it is. The 8th article is the government of the day. The government of the day is external to, but bound by the will of, Parliament, and is therefore free to conduct private business if such business is in the immediate national interest of the people or in the immediate interest of national security, and is fully disclosed, without redaction, in the fullness of time and within living memory of Parliament and the people. The government of the day can pass no law or regulation without the will of Parliament, nor any law or regulation that contradicts or limits these articles. The first lines here, the government of the day is external to, but bound by the will of Parliament. That is basically because although government is primarily made up of members of Parliament, it is separate to Parliament. And it does need to be free to conduct private business. I mean, a lot of the time people have a very simplistic view of politics and diplomacy. And two countries could be trying to get to a common aim, and yet the populaces that they represent could have two totally different worldviews. And so negotiating in public, there would be constantly coming up against opposition that would disappear once the compromise solution is there. And once they've arranged the compromise solution sort of behind closed doors and then announce it to the public can go, oh yeah, actually it's not a bad idea. But it's hard to get there fighting the will of the people simply because the two populations are diametrically opposed, or think they are diametrically opposed. And of course, obviously, when it comes to national security, you can't be telling everybody exactly what you're doing. Your enemies, you can't be telling your enemies exactly what you're doing. And so it's okay that the government can conduct private business, but as it says in the last line of the first paragraph, as long as it is fully disclosed, without redaction, and in the fullness of time and within living memory of Parliament and the people. Well, this basically means that when the last serving member of the cabinet that was there when the decision was made leaves Parliament, it has to be disclosed. Or before then, and before the last person from the alive at the time the event happened, it has to be disclosed, depending whichever is the earlier, and obviously without redaction, because in a democracy the government cannot do what the people don't know about. I mean, that sounds a bit simplistic and a bit woolly. Well, not woolly, but hippie. but it is the sort of aim you are aiming at when you're trying to develop democracy. That's the sort of idealism you're trying to aim at, is open government. And the last paragraph, the government of the day can pass no law or regulation without the will of Parliament. Well, if that doesn't get rid of, it will severely curtail the prerogative, the royal prerogative, and which is the government's to use, and nor any law or regulation that contradicts or limits these articles for obvious reasons. Only Parliament can, well, Parliament can't pass any laws or regulations that contradict or limit these articles, but only Parliament can authorise the plebiscite required to change these articles. So, this bill is there until the people themselves think that this bill can go. Article 9 is the freedom of election. No individual, group or political party that adheres to these articles can be proscribed by Parliament or be prevented from standing for election unless they are an individual that does not qualify as eligible to vote. As I said in the charges laid against Parliament, the prescription of political parties doesn't work. As long as the party does not directly promote or commit acts of violence, there is no excuse for prescribing them simply because you find their views abhorrent. It doesn't matter whether it is a communist party in the image of Khmer Rouge who wants to kick all the suburbanites out into the field and seize all their property, or if it's a Holocaust denying neo-Nazi party. You can't prescribe political parties because the bell curve that is democracy only works if you sample the whole population. If you start cutting out parts of the sample, it skews your results and it leads to you believing the popular will is leading more to one direction or another than it actually is. And so basically everybody needs to be able to stand, just because even if the vast majority of people find their views abhorrent, it makes no difference, because at the end of the day, these extremists, these extreme parties, most of the time they won't even get their deposits back, let alone win a seat. I should just point out the reason why there's no mention here of regular intervals for elections is because that's already covered in the 1688 Bill of Rights and subsequent legislation. Now, the qualification to vote is given to any person who is a British, Irish or qualifying Commonwealth citizen, is resident at an address in the UK, or a UK citizen living abroad who has been registered to vote in the UK in the last 15 years, and is over 18 years of age, having paid 5 years Class 1 National Insurance contribution or subsequent equivalent, or has completed since turning the age of 14 960 hours voluntary community or social service or subsequent equivalent. Well, up until the part where it says is over 18 years of age, that is directly out of current British electoral law. The part about having paid 5 years Class 1 National Insurance contribution or subsequent equivalent, or has completed since turning the age of 14 960 hours voluntary community or social service or subsequent equivalent, or pro rata, a mixture of the two, is because unlike a lot of the pseudo middle class champagne socialists out there, I'm a genuine socialist. I don't think that society owes you anything until you have contributed towards society. And until 1970, the voting age was 21, while until the 1st of September 1972, the school leaving age was 15, meaning that most people had contributed to society for 6 years prior to their first vote. Before 1970, and 3 years before 1972. And today, people must stay in education or training until they're 18. So most have contributed nothing to society by the time they get the first vote. and also that non-UK born nationals should have contributed to the UK society before having a say in how that society runs itself once they get citizenship. Now, that's just my own personal thing I've put in there, and I would be, if that was the only thing blocking this piece of legislation from getting through, then I would drop it like a hot brick. And Article 9 finishes up with unless they are convicted persons detained in pursuance of their sentences, excluding contempt of court, or anyone found guilty within the previous 25 years of corrupt or illegal practices in connection with an election, or a member of the House of Lords. And that again is taken directly from the current voting right legislation. Apart from the fact that I've increased the exclusion for people found guilty of corrupt or illegal practices in connection with an election to 25 years. And again, that's just my own personal opinion, and I'd be willing for that to go back to, I think it was the original 5 years. Article 10 is the membership of Parliament. The membership of Parliament, appointed, elected, or employed, gives the members power over the people, and as such should be considered as privilege and membership as vocation and not career employment, and its remuneration should reflect such. Furthermore, holders of such positions of power privilege need to be held to a higher moral standard than the law holds the people to, and therefore, once becoming a member of Parliament, any transgressions of the law or moral standards as defined by the people should result in the compulsory resignation of any appointed, elected, or employed members until such time as an individual is re-elected by the people. Now, this is quite vague in the way it says, and remuneration should reflect that. Because again, this is a part of administrative law, so it's trying to create an attitude within Parliament in this case, rather than saying you will only get paid national average wage or multiple of thereof. And it's also trying to redefine above the law. Above the law, in my mind, does not mean outside the law. Above the law means to a higher moral standard. If you are involved in the writing of laws, then you must be living your life to a moral standard that is higher than that law. Um, Otherwise, you're a hypocrite. And the one thing you need to try to constantly remove from politics and the law is hypocrisy. I mean, this doesn't just apply to Parliament either. I mean, if you're involved in any part of the law, so the judiciary, the police as well, they have to be held to a higher moral standard. And this is why on here it says that it should result in the compulsory resignation of appointed, elected, or employed members of the House of Parliament. Because well, it used to be done automatically. There used to be this, ministers and backbenchers would fall upon their own swords. But since the arrival of the ideologically vacuous career politicians, um, that's ended, and so this should hopefully sort of get that standard back into Parliament. And the reason that it says until re-elected is because people do deserve a second chance. People do make mistakes, and if they make the efforts to correct their mistakes and try to change their lives, then yes, if they do get re-elected get forgiven by the constituencies and get re-elected, then yes, they can rejoin Parliament until the next time they get it wrong and they have to resign again. Article 11 is the reparation of the abuses of the powers of Parliament. All and any laws, statutes, and regulations within the body of the law of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, that in whole or in part, by their writing or their current interpretations, contradict, constrain, or in any other way limit the application of these rights by the people, are to be forthwith and with immediate effect repealed and rescinded by all relevant parliaments and statutory bodies. Well, I think that's pretty self-explanatory there. You can't bring in laws giving us these rights, granting us these rights and these freedoms, if there are still laws on the statute that prevent these rights and these freedoms. So basically, Parliament would be pretty busy going back and amending or repealing all the laws that contradict the Bill of Common Rights. Article 12 is the Parliamentary Oath of Allegiance. I, insert name here, do swear that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to the people of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and bear witness to their views and opinions in this place under Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, her heirs and successors, according to law, by the will of the people, so help me God. Obviously, this is just a suggestion, but the oath of allegiance does need to change to reflect the fact that the sovereignty of Parliament has now been redefined as coming from the will of the people. And so all I did was add in the words in blue. But obviously this would probably need, you know, people who know more about oath swearing than I do, could probably come up with a better suggestion. And that's about it at the moment for as far as the bill goes. But I hope this video will elicit some stimulating conversations in the comment section so we can continue to develop the bill further. But remember to keep it civil. I mean, disagreements in conversation are never worth falling out over. And if you are the sort of person who is so emotionally immature that you can't face ideas and opinions that run contrary to you or challenge your worldview without the recourse to childish name calling, then you are a child, and children should be seen and not heard. So in other words, if you've got nothing constructive to say, either for or against, shut up, because the grown-ups are talking. Anyway, don't forget to comment, like and subscribe, share and remind. See you next time.